Okay, day 2. Let's kind of pick up where we left off. I got to be honest with you, let's make sure we are really focused and make sure we're really paying attention today, because this kind of gets a little bit difficult. So let's jump right into it. With example 2, we're going to be completing the square. Now, this is kind of another form of factoring. So hopefully you remember how to factor. For letter E, I'm thinking two numbers that multiply to get positive 18. Those same two numbers have to add to get negative 10. If you think about it, there aren't two numbers that multiply to get 18 and add to get negative 10, so I have to factor this a different way. The way we're going to do that is we're going to complete the square. The advice that I would give you when you're completing the square, always look for the middle term even. I would never complete the square unless that middle term is even. So what I mean by the middle term, take a look at letter E. That middle term is that negative 10x, so that's even, and therefore that's why I'm going to complete the square. So your thought process should be, okay, first step, can I factor this problem? If you say no to that, then your second step will be, can I complete the square? There'll be a third step, we'll talk about that later. So how do I complete the square? Well, first step, I see that positive 18 is completely useless where it is because I can't factor that. So I'm going to move that positive 18 to the other side. This might look familiar from Algebra 2. Notice that I left room on both sides to complete the square. Whatever you do to one side, you have to do to the other side, so that's why I put those two lines there. Okay, here's the difficult part. To complete the square, what I do is I take half of the middle term. Okay, so completing the square, first thing I noticed was that the middle term was even. Second step, I moved that positive 18 to the other side. Third step, I'm going to take half of the middle term and square it. Half of negative 10 is negative 5. When I square that, that is the number I'm going to add to both sides. So now I have completed the square. Left-hand side, left-hand side, now I can factor that. Two numbers that multiply to get positive 25 and add to get negative 10. It's going to be negative 5 times negative 5. The advice that I will give you from here, as long as you complete the square properly, this negative 5 right here will always be the same as this negative 5 right here. Whenever you complete the square, whenever you factor that, that number should always be the same. And then what I did is I added negative 18 and positive 25 to get 7. This should look like exactly what we did yesterday. How do I solve for x? Well, from here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the square root of both sides. So when I take the square root of both sides, I get x minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 7. Solve for x, you get 5 plus or minus root 7. Remember, those are the exact. How would you get the decimal versions of those? Hopefully you remember that from yesterday. Okay, letter F. Let's try again. Let's see if we can factor it first. Two numbers that multiply to get 6, but add to get negative 8, not possible. So my second thought process is, can I complete the square? Okay, middle term is even, so I know I can complete the square. How do I do that? I start by taking that 6 and moving it to the other side. Notice that I left room to complete the square. Next step, I know I take half of the middle term and square it. That's the number I'm going to add to both sides. Next step, Factor that left-hand side. Remember we talked about it. This number and this number, they match. Okay? They're always going to match. How do I solve from here? Well, I take the square root of both sides. Solve for x. Looks like that's my answer. Okay, G and H. I'll do one more with you, and then I'm going to have you try letter H on your own. So, G. Okay, let's start completing the square. Move that -8 to the other side. Take half of the middle term and square it. That's the number you're going to add to both sides. Factor left-hand side. Start solving for x. Hopefully you remember how to break down square root of 12. Square root of 4 times the square root of 3, which turns into 2 root 3. Solve for x. Okay, your turn. Start to finish. Try letter H. Move that 16 to the other side. Half of the middle term and square it. Factor. Square root. Solve for x. Okay, let's keep going. Hopefully completing the square. Hopefully you got it. Last way to factor. Quadratic formula. That should look very, very, very familiar to you. If you remember from Algebra 2, if you had Mrs. Mixa, she would sing a song for you. The Pop Goes the Weasel. I'm not going to sing it. I'm a terrible singer. I know you would love to hear that, but I'm not going to do it. So quadratic formula, hopefully that looks familiar. Just to kind of give you an idea, remember, it's got to be equal to 0 first. Once it's equal to 0, your a is always going to be attached to the x squared. The b will always be attached to the x. The c will always be your constant. Okay, so remember that. All right, let's try 2 of them using quadratic formula. So letter A, first thing I notice is not equal to 0. Let's get it equal to 0. Okay, once I have it equal to 0, I know from here, identify, there's A, B, and C. Simply plug A, B, and C into your quadratic formula. It says take the opposite of B, which is 4, plus or minus the square root. It says take B and square it. Minus 4 times A times C, all over 2 times A. Let's work on inside the square root. -4 squared is 16. -4 times 2 times 7 is -56. Combine your like terms. Think square root of -40. I can definitely simplify that. So I'm going to make it positive first. I root 40. Simplify that from there. Same deal. Notice all 3 of them on the outside are divisible. So let's go ahead and divide them to get my answer. 2 plus or minus I root 10 all over 2. Okay, let's do one more. Letter B. Quadratic formula. Identify A, B, and C. X equals, okay, I just kind of showed you this one. Take the opposite of B, plus or minus the square root. Take B and square it, minus 4 times A times C, all over 2A. Simplify that from there. Keep going. Notice, can't simplify that any further, so it looks like that is my answer. So, let's wrap it up. Think your thought process. Okay, Can I factor? That should always be your first thought. If I can't factor, my next thought process is that I want to try to complete the square. I only want to complete the square when that middle term is even. If it's not, if I can't factor it, if I can't complete the square, then my last ditch effort is going to be to always use that quadratic formula.